Imagine there is a single machine that every country wants, not a weapon, not a supercomputer. A machine that quietly fills up bank accounts and city tax coffers and retirement funds. When it arrives, wages jump. Cafes and car dealerships and home builders spring up around it. Teenagers go straight from high school into decent jobs. Towns that were sleepy suddenly have traffic jams at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. And then, after about a generation, sometimes two, the machine starts to hum a little quieter. The overtime dries up. The second shift goes first, then the third shift. A few years later, the machine is gone. The jobs are somewhere else. The tax revenue is somewhere else. The chance to join the middle class is somewhere else. But the strange thing is, the machine itself never disappears. It just moves, from one country to the next, from one set of families to another. That machine is factory work at scale, mass manufacturing. For roughly the past 250 years, factory manufacturing has behaved like what you could call a middle-class engine. It has parked itself first in Britain, then in the United States, then in Japan, then in China, and each time it has done roughly the same thing. It has taken a low to middle income country, flooded it with industrial jobs, raised wages, thickened the tax base, and then, once wages rise and new competitors appear, it has rolled away to somewhere cheaper. Not in a single dramatic night. More like a slow, grinding exit that only looks obvious once it is mostly over. In this video we are going to walk through that pattern, from Britain as the so-called workshop of the world, to mid-20th century America, to post-war Japan, to the rise of factory China, and then to the countries that are quietly being lined up as the next stops on this global assembly line. Along the way, we will ask a pretty uncomfortable question. If manufacturing really is a kind of middle-class machine that sets up in a country for something like 25 to 40 years and then moves on, which countries today are being lifted up by it, and which of them are most at risk of waking up in a few decades and realizing that the machine has left town? Before we start jumping around the map, it is worth slowing down and asking a basic question. Why has manufacturing played this role at all? Why do steel mills and car plants and electronics factories, and not just software firms or tourism, show up again and again at the very centre of stories about countries getting rich? Economists have a couple of answers, and they are surprisingly down to earth. First, factory work combines fairly high productivity with skills that ordinary people can realistically learn. If you have ever walked through a big factory, it is a mix. There are engineers and managers and programmers, but the bulk of the workforce is made up of people doing technical, repeatable tasks that you can be trained for in weeks or months, not in 8 years of medical school. In the United States, one recent study found that if a typical worker moves from a low-wage service job like a restaurant into manufacturing, their pay jumps by roughly 35% on average. That premium is bigger than in construction or agriculture, or even many white-collar sectors, and it is especially large in high-end manufacturing like cars, electronics and chemicals. Second, manufacturing has what people call a multiplier. Every factory job tends to support other jobs around it. Someone has to ship the parts, repair the machines, feed the workers at lunchtime, run the local clinics and schools that serve their families. When a big plant opens in a region, there is a wave of indirect hiring that follows. When a big plant closes, you see the same thing in reverse. Third, factory jobs line up unusually well with the kinds of people who need a ladder into the middle class the most. Workers without a university degree, often men, often in smaller cities. In the mid to late 20th century, these were the jobs that let a single earner support a family, pay a mortgage, and send kids to college in places from the English Midlands to the American Midwest. So when we talk about manufacturing as a middle-class machine, we are not saying it is the only way to get there. Modern economies can grow rich through services, finance, or technology. But historically, for most countries, serious national prosperity has gone hand in hand with building things in large quantities and selling them to the rest of the world, and historically, that ability has not stayed in one place. So let us start where this pattern really kicked off, with Britain in the age of steam and soot and the very first factories. If you had walked through northern England in the middle of the 19th century, the scale of what was happening would have been hard to miss. Coal mines, iron works, textile mills, railways, shipyards. The landscape itself seemed to be turning into a machine. By around 1860, Britain was producing roughly 2/3 of the world's coal, about half of the world's iron and cotton textiles, and close to 1/5 of all industrial goods on Earth. A few decades later, in the 1870s, it was still responsible for about 47% of global pig iron production and close to 40% of steel. That is not just an industrial lead, that is industrial domination. Those exports paid for imports of food and raw materials. They supported a navy that protected trade routes. They funded a growing professional class of clerks, engineers, lawyers, and teachers. Factory towns such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow were grim and polluted, but they were also places where wages, by 19th century standards, were rising, and where ordinary people were gradually gaining access to consumer goods that had once been luxuries. You could think of Victorian Britain as the first place where the manufacturing machine parked itself at true global scale. It did not mean everyone was comfortable or that inequality vanished. But over the course of the 19th century, industrialisation drove huge gains in average income and living standards for British workers. So what happened? Why is Britain today not the default factory floor of the planet? Part of the answer is simply that other countries caught up. The Industrial Revolution was never going to be exclusively British forever. The United States and Germany learned the same technologies, had bigger domestic markets, and by the late 19th century were outproducing Britain in key heavy industries such as steel. But the real twist in our story comes much later, in the late 20th century, when Britain went through something that now feels eerily familiar to people in the United States and Japan, and increasingly parts of China. By the 1970s, manufacturing in the United Kingdom still accounted for roughly a quarter of the economy. Around 7.1 million people worked in factories, from car plants to chemical works, and those jobs were still the backbone of many regions. Then, in a relatively short period, it changed. Between 1979 and 1992, British manufacturing employment fell from about 7.1 million to 4.5 million. By 2016, only about 2.7 million people worked in manufacturing, and the sector's share of the economy had shrunk to around 10%. Traditional industries such as textiles, steel, shipbuilding, and coal collapsed or dramatically downsized. Imported goods from Asia undercut local producers. A wave of restructuring under successive governments favoured finance and services in London and the South, over heavy industry in the North, the Midlands and Scotland. If you visit former steel and shipbuilding regions like Teesside today, you see the long shadow of that shift. The giant blast furnaces are gone or repurposed. Unemployment and poverty linger in many neighbourhoods. Politically, these areas have become fertile ground for movements that promise to reverse deindustrialisation, or at least to give voice to the people who lived through it. The crucial thing, though, is that while Britain's share of manufacturing jobs and output shrank, the global manufacturing machine itself did not stop. It had already moved first across the Atlantic and then later across the Pacific. That brings us to the second big stop on this tour, the United States. If Victorian Britain was the workshop of the world, the United States in the mid-20th century was the workshop of the democratic world, and then some. By the early 20th century, the United States had overtaken Britain as the largest industrial economy. On the eve of the First World War, its share of global output had already climbed to around 19%. By 1960, at the height of its post-war economic dominance, the United States accounted for close to 29% of world GDP, a huge slice. Of that story was manufacturing, especially after the Second World War. During the war itself, nearly 4 out of 10 American workers were in manufacturing. That share peaked in October 1943, when close to 39% of all employment was tied to making things. Tanks, planes, ships, munitions, vehicles, and the civilian goods that still had to be produced alongside them. Even after demobilization, factories remained the backbone of the labour market. Through the 1950s and 1960s, millions of Americans without college degrees could walk into unionized manufacturing jobs that offered good wages, health insurance, and pensions. Steel mills in Pennsylvania, auto plants in Michigan and Ohio, appliance factories in the Midwest and South, electronics assembly lines in California. These were the places where the American middle class as we picture it today really formed. You can see it in the numbers. Manufacturing employment in the United States rose steadily over decades and peaked at about 19.5 million jobs in 1979. As a share of total employment, manufacturing was still a little over 20% around 1980. If your parents or grandparents grew up in a factory town in that era, you know what that meant on the ground. Steady paychecks, Little leagues and band uniforms and college savings funded by assembly lines and machine shops. And then, again, the same machine that had lifted people into stability started to move. From the late 1970s onward, American manufacturing employment began a long decline. By 2009, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, those 19.5 million factory jobs had fallen to about 11.5 million, a drop of roughly 41% over 30 years. By the end of 2024, even after a partial rebound, manufacturing jobs stood at around 12.9 million and made up only about 8% of total employment. What changed? Economists point to a mix of forces. Automation allowed firms to produce more with fewer workers. Demand in rich countries shifted towards services like healthcare, education, and entertainment. Trade agreements and cheaper transportation made it easier to source goods from abroad. And crucially, new manufacturing powers emerged. At first, that competition came from Europe and Japan. Later, it came from a cluster of East Asian economies, and then, most dramatically, from China. You've probably heard the term China shock. That is the research that tried to measure how much of the sudden collapse in American factory jobs in the 2000s was linked to imports from China after it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Different studies give different numbers, but many find that Chinese import competition was associated with somewhere between roughly 1 million and 2 million lost American manufacturing jobs between about 1999 and 2011, concentrated in industries and regions that directly competed with Chinese goods. Other work argues the effect was smaller, that technology and competition from other countries mattered at least as much, and that overall trade with China brought consumer benefits and job gains elsewhere in the economy. What almost everyone agrees on, though, is that the regions most exposed to import competition saw plant closures, long-term drops in employment and wages for less educated workers, and rising social problems from poverty to addiction. Towns in the American Midwest and South that had once thrived on steel, furniture, textiles, and electronics suddenly found themselves on the losing end of a very long global supply chain. By the early 21st century, the middle-class machine that had powered American prosperity after the Second World War had clearly shifted elsewhere. And just like Britain before it, the United States responded with a mix of nostalgia, anger, and new political movements that promised to bring the factories back. But where had those factories gone? To answer that, we have to make a brief stop in Japan. Japan's story is the clearest example of this pattern playing out inside a single lifetime. In 1945, Japan was devastated. Its cities had been bombed, its empire dismantled, its economy shattered. Yet within a single generation, it became a manufacturing superpower. From the 1950s through the 1980s, Japan pursued an export-led growth strategy centered on manufacturing. Protected domestic markets, close cooperation between government ministries and major industrial groups, and a relentless focus on improving quality and efficiency turned Japanese companies into global champions in industries from steel and shipbuilding to automobiles and consumer electronics. By the late 1980s, Japanese brands like Toyota, Sony, Panasonic, and Honda symbolized cutting-edge engineering. Manufacturing was a huge part of Japan's economy. Even today, it still accounts for around 20% of Japanese GDP, one of the highest shares among rich countries. The country built an urban middle class whose stability rested on factory-based work and the famous lifetime employment system at big firms. But as Japan got richer, wages climbed and its currency strengthened, especially after the Plaza Accord in the mid-1980s, when major economies agreed to push up the value of the yen. Labour-intensive industries like basic textiles and low-end electronics began to move offshore, first to places like South Korea and Taiwan, then to Southeast Asia, and later to China. Economists and the media began to talk about the hollowing out of Japanese manufacturing as firms shifted production abroad to stay competitive. The flying geese model, a theory first developed by a Japanese economist, tried to describe this process. In that picture, Japan was the lead goose, moving up the value chain from simple goods to more complex ones as wages rose. As it did, it shed low-end manufacturing to the next tier of economies, like South Korea and Taiwan, which then passed those industries onto Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and eventually China and Vietnam. For ordinary Japanese workers, that shift was a mixed story. The country remained an advanced manufacturer of cars, machinery, and high-tech components. But the easy gains from moving farm workers into factory jobs were gone. Growth slowed. Secure lifetime factory jobs became rarer for younger generations. Concerns about hollowing out became part of Japan's political debate in the 1990s and 2000s, in much the same way that offshoring entered American politics. Which brings us to the biggest chapter in this story so far, China. If you think of Britain's 19th century boom and America's post-war boom and Japan's miracle era as earlier waves of factory-driven growth, then China's rise from the 1980s onward is a tidal wave. In 1980, China's manufacturing output was modest on the global stage, and its share of world manufacturing value added was roughly 5%. The country was still overwhelmingly rural and poor, just starting to open up after decades of central planning. Then came four things: market-oriented reforms, huge investments in infrastructure, an almost endless supply of low-wage labour migrating from the countryside to coastal cities, and access to global markets. Between 1980 and 2023, China's manufacturing output grew from roughly $130 billion to around $4.8 trillion. Its share of global manufacturing jumped from about 5% to close to 30%. By 2010, it had overtaken the United States as the world's largest manufacturer, and by the early 2020s it was producing more than a quarter of all manufactured goods on Earth, according to United Nations data. Inside China, manufacturing loomed even larger. It accounted for roughly a quarter to a little over a quarter of GDP in recent years, one of the highest shares among big economies, and directly employed tens of millions of workers. In just the first decade of this century, official data show manufacturing enterprise employment rising from about 86 million in 2002 to 99 million in 2009, far more factory workers than any other country. Those jobs, combined with urbanization and construction, helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and created a vast new middle class. Manufacturing wages, which had been a tiny fraction of American levels, more than doubled in local currency terms between 2002 and 2009, and nearly tripled in dollar terms, rising from around 2% of US manufacturing compensation to about 5% over that span. More recent estimates suggest Chinese factory wages have continued to climb and now stand at close to 30% of US levels on average, and even higher relative to some middle-income competitors like Mexico. For global companies, China offered an almost unbeatable combination: low labour costs, increasingly good infrastructure, improving quality, and eventually a massive domestic market. Supply chains in electronics, apparel, toys, machinery, and countless other sectors oriented themselves around Chinese industrial clusters. If you have an object on your desk right now, there is a good chance it passed through a Chinese factory at some stage. From a distance, this looked a lot like Britain in the 1860s, or America in the 1950s, or Japan in the 1980s, a country using manufacturing exports as its main ladder into prosperity. But as with those earlier cases, the picture is beginning to change. Three big forces are pushing companies to rethink their reliance on Chinese factories. First, wages and other labour costs in China have risen sharply as the country has grown richer and its workforce has aged. The easy supply of young migrants willing to work long hours for very low pay has largely been exhausted. In major coastal manufacturing hubs, companies report double-digit annual wage increases in the 2000s and 2010s, and broad estimates suggest that by the mid-2020s, average Chinese factory pay has climbed to roughly 28% of American levels and is now higher than in many competing manufacturing hubs. Second, global politics and trade tensions have changed the risk calculation. Tariffs imposed by the United States and other countries on Chinese goods, along with concerns about supply chain resilience after the pandemic and during geopolitical shocks, have made it more attractive for companies to diversify production. This is where the phrase China plus one comes in. Many multinational firms now aim to keep a significant manufacturing presence in China because the local ecosystem is still incredibly efficient, but they also want at least one other major base, often in Southeast Asia or South Asia or Mexico, to reduce dependence on any single country. Third, technology is changing what manufacturing even means. Automation and industrial robots have spread rapidly in China itself. In 2024, China installed almost 300,000 industrial robots, close to 10 times as many as the United States did that year, and now accounts for more than half of global robot installations. That raises productivity but also means that future manufacturing growth will not create as many traditional assembly line jobs as in the past, either in China or in whatever countries try to take its place. So is the factory machine leaving China? Not in the dramatic way it appeared to leave Britain's coal valleys or some American steel towns. China is still overwhelmingly the world's largest manufacturer and is likely to remain so for some time unless there is an extraordinary shock. But at the margins, especially in more labour-intensive and lower-value segments like basic garments and simple electronics assembly, the machine is already rolling along new roads. If you look around the developing world today, you can see several countries that look, in some ways, like earlier versions of Britain or America or Japan or China. They are where the next generation of global factory towns is being built. Vietnam is one of the clearest examples. Back in 1990, manufacturing accounted for less than 8% of Vietnam's economy. By 2022, it had jumped to roughly 27%, thanks largely to foreign direct investment in export-oriented factories. Foreign-owned firms now account for well over half of Vietnam's exports, especially in phones, computers, machinery, apparel, and textiles. One company, Samsung alone, is responsible for roughly 1/5 of the country's export value. By 2024, Vietnam's total merchandise exports were around $400 billion, with industrial and processed goods making up nearly 90% of that. Electronics, phones, machinery, textiles, footwear, and wood products are all multi-billion-dollar export categories. Nike now makes more than half of its global footwear in Vietnam, significantly more than in China. In practical terms, that means that the same kinds of stories you heard about Chinese factory towns a couple of decades ago are now being told about industrial parks outside Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. Young workers leaving farms, earning steady wages for the first time, sending money home, buying motorcycles and smartphones, and gradually anchoring a new urban middle class. Bangladesh, especially in garments, is another case. In the early 1980s, clothing made up only a small share of Bangladesh's exports. Within about 10 years, it rose to around 60%, and by the early 2020s, ready-made garments accounted for more than 80% of the country's export earnings. Bangladesh is now the second largest exporter of clothing in the world after China. Tens of billions of dollars worth of shirts, jeans, and other apparel sold in Europe and North America come from Bangladeshi factories. Those factories have a troubling history of low wages and unsafe conditions, and there is an ongoing debate about whether the development path they offer is fair or sustainable. But in purely economic terms, they have played the same role that textile mills once played in Britain or New England or Japan. They have been the starter motor of an industrial middle class, particularly for women entering the workforce. India is trying to engineer its own version of this story on a much larger scale. For years, Indian leaders have talked about raising manufacturing's share of GDP to around a quarter. In practice, that goal has proved hard to reach. Manufacturing's share has hovered closer to the mid-teens and actually slipped to roughly 14% in the fiscal year ending in early 2025, according to recent data, despite ambitious government incentive programs. Still, there are signs of momentum. A series of production-linked incentive schemes has attracted tens of billions of dollars in investment commitments across sectors such as electronics, autos, pharmaceuticals, and solar equipment, and government figures credit those programs with generating well over 1 million direct and indirect manufacturing jobs so far. India's domestic electronics production alone has roughly quadrupled in value over the past decade, and the country has become a significant exporter of smartphones and other devices. Then there is Mexico. Mexico has long had a manufacturing base integrated with the United States through the old Maquiladora system and agreements like NAFTA and now USMCA. Its manufacturing sector today accounts for a little over 20% of GDP, similar to Japan in that sense, and the country has become a major exporter of automobiles, auto parts, electronics, and appliances. What is new in the 2020s is the push toward nearshoring. Companies that used to source components or finished goods from China now look to Mexico to be closer to the American market, reduce transport times, and sidestep some tariffs. That is especially true for goods where shipping is bulky or where supply chain security is a big concern. If you zoom out, you can see a pattern that looks somewhat like those flying geese. Japan in the lead, then South Korea and Taiwan, then Southeast Asia and China, and now, increasingly, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Mexico. slotting into parts of the manufacturing ecosystem. At this point you might be thinking, all right, I see the migration. But is it really as neat as a 25 to 40-year cycle? Does the middle-class machine really arrive, run for a generation, and then simply leave? Reality is obviously messier than that. There is no timer hidden inside a factory that goes off after 30 years and forces it to move. But when you lay the timelines side by side, the rough rhythm is hard to ignore. Britain's most intense period of industrial dominance runs from the late 18th century to roughly the late 19th century, about 100 years. But the really transformative period for its domestic middle class, when it is clearly the unmatched workshop of the world, is something like the middle of that span, from the early 1800s to the 1860s and 1870s. After that, other powers start to catch up, and by the mid-20th century, Britain is visibly struggling to maintain its manufacturing base. In the United States, the factory machine really takes off from the 1920s through the 1970s, a roughly 50-year period when moving from farm or service work into a unionized factory job is one of the most reliable ways into the middle class. Manufacturing employment peaks in 1979. The decades after that are ones of slow erosion and then sharp decline. Japan's miracle era stretches from the 1950s through the end of the 1980s. That is about 30 to 40 years in which export factories absorb rural workers and turn them into urban consumers. After the bubble bursts around 1990, growth slows, the yen is strong, and firms increasingly move the most labour-intensive production abroad. China's own hyper-industrial phase begins in the 1990s and runs through to roughly the mid-2010s, a quarter-century or so of double-digit export growth and relentless factory expansion. In the 2020s, manufacturing is still huge in China, but the easy gains from cheap labour are gone, wages are much higher, and companies are experimenting with moving parts of their production to places like Vietnam and Bangladesh, or automating more aggressively at home. So the cycle is not a precise metronome, but it does look like a pattern. A country opens up and industrializes. Labour is cheap, infrastructure improves, investment floods in. For 25 to 40 years, factory work is the main motor dragging people into the urban middle class. Then, as wages rise and the country ages and people demand higher living standards, it becomes less competitive for the most basic kinds of manufacturing. New, poorer countries step in at the bottom of the ladder. The original country tries to move up to more advanced industries and services. From the point of view of a global supply chain manager, this makes sense. From the point of view of a worker in a steel town or an auto town, it can feel like betrayal. So what does all of this mean for the question we started with? Who is next to be lifted up by the factory machine, and who is likely to feel it leave? Historical patterns suggest a few things. First, building a manufacturing middle class is still possible. Vietnam's recent experience looks in many ways like a compressed version of China's earlier path. Manufacturing's share of its GDP has jumped from single digits to the high 20s since 1990. Foreign firms account for the bulk of exports, and industrial wages are rising from very low bases. Bangladesh's garment factories, however problematic, have helped transform a once desperately poor, mostly rural country into a lower middle-income economy. India and Mexico are pulling in investment aimed at serving both export markets and their own large domestic consumers. Second, the benefits of hosting the global factory floor are not automatic or evenly shared. Research on the China shock shows clearly that when manufacturing grows or shrinks in a region, the gains or losses are highly concentrated. Certain towns boom, others stagnate. When competition wipes out factories in one place, displaced workers do not always move or find equivalent jobs, even if the national economy keeps growing overall. Third, the exit phase of the cycle seems to be getting harsher politically. In Britain's 19th century heyday, there was no precedent for what happened when the old industrial centres lost ground. In the late 20th century, when that deindustrialisation hit, the country's politics convulsed. In the United States, the long erosion of factory jobs over recent decades has been linked by many analysts to rising regional inequality and to the appeal of populist politicians who promise to restore past industrial glory. In Japan, worries about hollowing out and lifetime employment helped shape debates over how much to open markets and how aggressively to reform. China has not yet gone through a comparable wave of outright factory closures on the scale of Britain in the 1980s or the American Rust Belt in the early 2000s. But if rising wages, demographic aging, and trade frictions squeeze out lower-end manufacturing jobs in parts of coastal China, over the next 2 decades, the politics could be intense. Fourth, automation means the next generation of factory booms might offer fewer traditional middle-class jobs per unit of output. A hyper-automated car plant or electronics factory can generate billions in exports with far fewer workers than the grimy assembly lines of the mid-20th century. That is as true in Vietnam or India as it is in China or the United States. So when we ask, who is next to be lifted up and then let down, we should be careful. Some analysts look at Vietnam's dependence on foreign-owned factories and say, this looks like a classic case. The country gets rapid growth and industrial jobs today, but if it does not steadily move into higher value activities like design, branding and advanced components, it risks being stuck as an assembly platform that can be left behind when wages rise. Others point to Bangladesh and ask how sustainable an economy can be when more than 80% of exports come from one low-margin, labour-intensive industry that is under constant pressure to cut costs and that faces growing scrutiny over working conditions and carbon emissions. In India's case, there is a live debate over whether it will ever become the kind of manufacturing giant that China is, or whether its comparative advantage will remain in services and digital work. The government's own manufacturing share of GDP target has already been missed for 2025, despite big subsidy schemes, which suggest that building a middle class through factories alone is harder in today's world than it was in the 1960s or 1980s. Mexico, meanwhile, may benefit from nearshoring for years, especially in autos and electronics, but it has to grapple with security challenges, infrastructure gaps, and educational constraints that could limit how far it can climb the value chain. And what about countries that already saw the manufacturing machine crest and decline, like Britain, the United States, and Japan? Are they doomed to slow growth and permanent industrial nostalgia? Here is where the story becomes less mechanical and more open-ended. History suggests that when manufacturing's share of employment falls in rich countries, it does not necessarily mean that manufacturing output disappears. In Britain, for example, the total value of manufacturing output in 2007 was roughly double what it had been in 1958, even though far fewer people worked in factories because productivity rose so much. In the United States, real manufacturing output remains near record levels, even though the share of workers in the sector has plunged. Japan still makes some of the world's most advanced machine tools, robots, and automotive components. So the machine does not so much vanish as it changes shape. It becomes more capital-intensive and knowledge-intensive. It employs engineers and technicians and logistics experts instead of masses of manual assembly workers. It uses more robots and fewer people. That is good news in terms of productivity and the ability to stay competitive even with higher wages. It is less good news if you're trying to recreate the exact kind of broad-based mid-skill factory middle class that existed in, say, Detroit in 1965. Which is why so many debates in rich countries today revolve around some version of this question. How do you build a middle class in a service-heavy, automated, globalized economy where manufacturing is no longer the main employer, but still matters a lot for exports, innovation, and national security? Different governments are trying different answers. The United States and Europe are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on industrial policy to encourage domestic production of semiconductors, electric vehicles, batteries, and other strategic goods. Britain is exploring green industrial strategies around offshore wind and low-carbon technologies in old industrial regions. Japan is attempting to maintain its leadership in advanced manufacturing while addressing demographic decline. Whether those efforts will succeed in restoring anything like the old factory-based version of the middle class is an open question. Many economists argue that the future of middle incomes in rich countries will depend more on combining services with technology, things like healthcare, education, and local services that are productivity enhanced by digital tools, than on bringing back mass employment in heavy industry. But even if the specific form of the middle-class machine changes, the deeper pattern we have been tracing is still crucial to understand. Whenever you hear that a country is becoming the new factory to the world, or that a region is on its way to becoming an industrial powerhouse, it is worth asking a few follow-up questions. Who is actually doing the investing? Are the factories owned locally, or by foreign firms who can move if conditions change? What share of the value of each product stays in the country in the form of wages, taxes, and local supplier contracts, versus being captured abroad through imported components and foreign ownership? Is the country slowly moving up the ladder into designing products, managing brands and producing advanced parts, or is it stuck at the most basic, most easily relocated steps of the chain? And, maybe most important, what is the plan for the day when wages are no longer the lowest and investors start looking elsewhere? History does not say that every country is destined to be used and abandoned. It does not say that manufacturing always arrives and always leaves on a fixed schedule. But it does show that riding a wave of factory growth without thinking about what comes after is a risky strategy. If you're watching this from a place that is suddenly full of new factories, whether that is northern Vietnam, a garment hub in Bangladesh, an electronics park in southern India, or a car corridor in northern Mexico, you are in a position very similar to where Chinese coastal cities were in the 1990s, where Japanese port cities were in the 1960s, where American steel towns were in the 1940s, or where British mill towns were in the 1820s. There is real opportunity. There is also a clock of some sort, even if no one can see the exact time left. And if you are watching this from a place that has already seen the factory machine slow down and roll away, an English steel town, a Midwestern city in the United States, an aging industrial suburb in Japan, then you already know what it feels like when that clock reaches zero. You also know that the choices made during the boom years about education, infrastructure, social safety nets, and diversification matter enormously for how painful the adjustment is. So when we look at the sequence Britain, United States, Japan, China, and then ask, who is next? The most honest answer is not a single country name, it is a set of paths. Some countries will use the manufacturing middle-class engine as a starting point, and then move into more complex higher-value activities before the basic factory work leaves. Others will stay in low-wage assembly too long and find that when the work moves on, they have not built enough that is rooted in their own skills and institutions. Some rich countries will manage to reinvent manufacturing in a more automated, higher-tech form that supports good jobs even with fewer workers. Others will cling to a memory of smokestacks and lose time they could have spent building new strengths. The machine is not destiny. It is an opportunity and a risk. But if you look across the last 2 centuries, one thing is consistent. The places that understood early that the factory was not just a source of jobs but a ladder into more sophisticated capabilities, research, design, logistics, complex services, were the ones that stayed prosperous even after the smokestacks thinned out. The ones that treated the factory era as an endless present, that assumed the machine would sit in their town forever, were the ones most shocked when the gate finally locked and the jobs were gone. So as you scroll past headlines about Vietnam's export surge, India's production-linked incentives, Mexico's nearshoring boom, or China's robot-filled plants, remember the deeper story. It is not just about where your phone or your car or your shirt is assembled this year. It is about which societies are using the current wave of manufacturing to build something that lasts beyond it, and which are effectively renting the middle-class machine for a few decades without a clear idea of what happens when the lease expires. If you found this way of looking at the global economy helpful, if it changed how you think about the towns that boom and the towns that are left behind, and if you want to dive deeper into the hidden patterns that shape who gets rich and who gets stranded, make sure you hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story.